We're bringing you boots on the ground insight from the ranchers, conservationists, and partners who are helping to preserve the best of the Golden State for generations to come. Join the California Rangeland Trust for inspiring stories of resilience, innovation, and hope as we get tuned into the land.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Tune Into the Land. I'm Michael Delbar, your host and the CEO of the California Rangeland Trust. Since its founding in 1917, the California Cattlemen's Association, or known as CCA for short, has been dedicated to representing California's ranchers and beef producers in legislative and regulatory affairs in California. For over a century, CCA has worked tirelessly to advocate for the interests of California ranchers at the state capitol, providing them with the education and resources necessary to sustain ranching in the Golden State. Recognizing the challenges local ranchers face, such as burdensome taxes, the threat of development, that's just to name a few here, CCA leaders took action 26 years ago to create a lasting solution. They founded the California Rangeland Trust, a land trust created by ranchers for ranchers to preserve rangelands for all Californians. We are proud to continue our close relationship with CCA today as they champion the causes of California's ranchers. One of their key areas of focus is policy and advocacy. So today, we're joined by CCA's leadership to discuss the pressing issues facing the ranching industry as the legislative session draws to a close. It is my pleasure to welcome to the podcast CCA President Steve Arnold, First Vice President Rick Roberti, and Vice President of Government Affairs Kirk Wilbur.
Good morning.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
So Steve, as the president, why don't you give us a little bit of history of California Cattlemen's Association? Tell us, for those who may not be familiar with the organization, who they are and what they do.
Well, we're a lobbying organization, and we have Kirk today to delve into that for everybody listening, primarily lobbying, but we've branched into a foundation that does a lot of educational work and outreach to our producers, helping them with technical problems they may or may not have. So that's Cattlemen have been in Sacramento for a lot of years, started out in Berkeley of all places, but that's why we're here in Sacramento primarily as a lobbying group.
So we're fortunate that we're at the Cattlemen's Association's mid-year meeting, and fortunately to get a few minutes of your time from all three of you. So thank you for taking a break from your busy activities this week to talk to us. How did you all get involved? Steve and Rick, how did you get involved with the organization?
Well, I was involved in my county, which is San Luis Obispo County, on and off for the last 40 years. But when I finished Ag Leadership, Farm Bureau was there knocking at my door and brought me onto the San Luis County Board. And I went through all the Sacramento things, all the chairs in San Luis, ended up on the state board for Farm Bureau. So we had a lot of experience on boards at a high level at that point. But when I got done with Farm Bureau, I was really back involved in San Luis Obispo County. And it's been kind of a straight up ride for me from there because I was president not that long ago down there. And now I'm here. So it's probably over the last 10 years, maybe 12, that I really got involved at the state level more for cattlemen's.
Rick, how about you?
Yeah, pretty similar to a lot of people, but mine may be a little different. My family was in the dairy business till the mid-50s in eastern Plumas County. So we grew up with the Grange, and we grew up with Farm Bureau being a very active part of what we did and where we went and the people that we knew. And being from the dairy side of it, we didn't get real Western right away, never have. But finally, when I was older, in my 20s, my friends were in Cattlemen, so I started going to Cattlemen's. I thought it was important. Like most, I went through the ranks, and they always need a president, and they always need a secretary. And finally, I became president. My wife became secretary. And then that's when we finally got started with working with CCA at a state level. And that's when I learned how important it is. We can do a lot of things as a locally, but we can't do the things we really need to do as far as policy goes until you get involved with the state. So that's where I've come from. And now I'm a first vice president and looking forward to doing a lot of things in the next few years. There's a lot of things to do. And our members need to know that it's not up to the staff and it's not up to the officers. It's up to the members to step up and do our part and help. We need all the help we can get, right, Steve? And a lot of times we don't want to do that. We're too busy. And as I've heard Steve say before, there's a short window between when you can actually serve. You're young, you're doing other things, then you have a family, your kids are growing up, you're going to Little League, you're going to all these things. And by the time the kids are gone, then you're trying to pay for all the things you spent while you're raising your kids. And so when you get a little older, that's the time we have to give back. And that's why I'm here, because I saw other people give back who had no more time than I did, but they knew it was important. And so I feel very blessed to be able to be a part of such a good organization.
Well, you're definitely right. There's no shortage of issues that the association has to deal with. And to help do that, you have some great staff, and they're not here today, but we have Kirk.
Yeah.
Just kidding. Kirk is wonderful. But how'd you get involved with the organization?
Yeah, so I graduated from law school in Sacramento in 2012, and the keynote speaker at my graduation let us know there were no jobs for any of us. So I desperately needed some work. The California Cattlemen's Association had an opening for an administrative assistant, which doesn't typically require a law degree. I applied for that job, and Billy Gatlin, thankfully, did hire me to be the administrative assistant at CCA. This was in 2013. 9 months later, a job opened up on the government affairs team. I asked for that because that was more in line with my education. Billy granted me that request, and 11 years later, I'm still at CCA. They can't get rid of me.
Well, we're glad you're there. How many counties? You, Rick and Steve, you both mentioned your roots in the county organizations. How many counties have cattlemen's associations? Do you know?
I'll go ahead and take this one. There are 35 local associations within the California Cattlemen's Association. Most of those are single county organizations. Steve is from the San Luis Obispo County Cattlemen's, for instance, but about 10 of them cover 2 or 3 or more counties. Rick, of course, is from the Plumas Sierra County Cattlemen's Association. So, we cover most of the state, but we do have fewer local associations than there are counties, because many counties combine to, improve their forces.
And what's the membership number statewide?
For the statewide association, we've got, I think, about 1,750 producer members. We do have, allied industry members. We've got folks who don't raise cattle but just want to support beef producers. So I think overall we probably have north of 2,000 members. Couldn't give you an exact number. But of course, we work to support California cattle producers. And of those, there's about 1,750 in the association statewide.
So piggybacking on that, what are the benefits to a producer or a supporter of the industry to be a member?
Well, I think without question, the number one benefit is Kirk's ability to deal with pending legislation early, often. But the amount of bills that he's gotten blocked in my time here is amazing. And the ones that have been tamped down into something that we can actually live with is amazing. So, I got to hand it to Billy and Kirk. Average bill introduction annually, as you know, Michael, is $2,300 to $2,700. The two of them read them all, and Kirk's counterpart, Jason, the lobbying organization, and decide which ones are going to be most impactful to CCA. And with our policies, because we are a policy-driven organization, with our policies, they look at every one of them, and they kind of give them, I think, a bit of a hierarchy on importance. And it goes from there. So the benefits that are tangible are more along the lines of the technical assistant, things that are coming out of the foundation. The intangibles are what Kirk does behind the scenes there, so that they may not know about.
Go ahead. A couple other benefits that I'll just point out real quick. One, I think, is our comms team. We have our California Cattlemen magazine that comes out monthly. I think that's probably one of the best cattle industry, if not one of the best ag publications in the West. Steve, our managing editor, does a fantastic job on that publication. Keep members informed through our weekly publication, the California Cattlemen Weekly, which comes out via email. There's some other benefits. We provide anaplasmosis vaccine to CCA members. Boluses, the folks can order out of our offices, selenium boluses, I should say. A number of benefits, but really the main benefit of CCA, thank you, Steve, for giving me some credit, but you've got a staff of, 6 or 7 folks that are absolutely excellent at everything they do, from our comm staff to our finance staff, Billy, who's operating the whole organization, down to our administrative assistant. Just you've got some great folks working for you in Sacramento, and that's the main benefit of the association.
So, Steve, you're 6 months left in your tenure as president?
5, Mike.
5? Not that you're counting or anything. How's it been in your tenure so far, and what do you see as you wind down your presidency?
It's actually been kind of fun, but it's probably been fun in the cause is mostly that we've had rainfall for the 2 years I've been in, and we've had really good markets. So, there's not a lot of...
It's all due to your leadership.
Yeah, well,
that's
I'll
perfect.
take that credit.
Yeah, we'll give it to him.
Yeah. But I think that those two things have made it a lot easier. When I was coming up through the ranks, you'd get into certain counties and there was issues that were a bit contentious. My predecessors, Mark and Tony, were both on the end of some barbs here and there, and I'm in the room hiding. But it's been real educational. It's been fun because obviously you get to see a lot of different country, how different counties do things. But yeah.
And Rick, and if you take the reins come December, what's your outlook for your future tenure here as president?
Well, there's no shortage of issues. I think for a long time, there's that saying in sports that defense wins championships, but we've been on the defense for so long in our industry, not just cattle, but ag in general, because we don't have the time. And that's one of the benefit I think of having organizations like Farm Bureau and Cattlemen, is that we can have some people that know what they're doing and know that they're doing their job right and they're taking care of us when we don't have the time to do that. We don't have time to. Cattlemen like to talk about family, the weather, and the market. Nobody wants to talk about AB, whatever it is. We can't even remember the numbers. So our big benefit is having people that do. But the upcoming year, I'm looking forward to it. Steve set a good example for me. We've got plenty of issues, and now we just got to get plenty of people to get in some roles that we can do something about it, because staff can really do a lot, but we're a membership organization, and if they don't have the membership behind them, and coming from a small local group, you find out, and as we travel to some of these groups, find out they're not involved in a state level. They take care of things at home, but we need their help in Sacramento, because that's where the policies are being passed, and those are the things they never see happen. But like Steve says, if they don't happen, then they're upset. But so many things have been stopped that nobody even knows that would make a big difference in their daily life.
Well, there's definitely no issues, no shortage of issue areas where you got water, insurance, you've got the Sonoma County Measure J issue, Williamson Act, of course, wildfires, which are always on the forefront, lack of processing facilities. There's so many issues. What do you see is the top ones that you're facing this year? I know it's tough to narrow down to that, but what's taking the most of your energy?
So you hit on some of them already. I sketched out, sort of what our top issue areas sort of constantly are. The exact contours, depending on, bills and regulations, will change from year to year. But I think our top issues year in and year out, certainly the whole time I've been at CCA, certainly wildfire resilience issues are always an issue for the California Cattlemen's Association. I think insurance largely falls sort of as a subset of that wildfire problem. We're seeing, you mentioned the Measure J in Sonoma County, but even at the state level and the national level, we're seeing many more attacks on livestock grazing in particular by radical animal rights organizations. We had to beat back a bill on that last year, worked on it a little bit more this year, fighting with groups like the Animal Legal Defense Fund. Air quality and greenhouse gas emissions comes up constantly. We're constantly working at the California Air Resources Board. There's dozens of bills introduced in the legislature every year dealing with transportation emissions that impact cattle trucking, methane emissions that impact dairying and ranching activities. Predator policy is one that we fight constantly. Wolves, of course, are a huge issue. Currently, mostly in the northeastern portion of the state, but of course, they've moved down to Tulare County and are likely to move into other parts of the state, deal with mountain lion issues, bear issues, other predators constantly before the legislature, Fish and Game Commission, and Department of Fish and Wildlife. So those are our big issues. Water rights, you mentioned, I fight on every year. So we can get into some of the specifics of bills that impact those areas this legislative session. But those 5 or so issue areas are ones that we're fighting every single year at the Capitol, both before the legislature and relevant regulatory bodies.
Well, let's touch on a couple of those just to, I know there's no shortage and we could be here for hours just going through them all. And 2,700 bills is, to me, are there really 2,700 things that need to be fixed in the state? Well, probably, but they're not fixing them. They're creating more problems. Typically, let's talk Major J. Sonoma County, it would...
Oh, you're talking. The audience is probably wondering what kind of major nerd would go through 2,700 bills. It's him, it's Kirk.
So Major J would eliminate confined animal feeding operations, but the way it's defined is pretty broad. What do you see as the effort that Cattlemen and others are putting in to defeat this measure? But then also, if it does pass, what are the ramifications outside of Sonoma County?
Yeah, so, Measure J, as a practical matter, is primarily likely to impact dairying and poultry operations in Sonoma County. But, of course, we're concerned about sort of the downstream effects of a proposition like this on the cattle industry elsewhere in California. I think the proponents of the proposition have been pretty clear that if this passes in Sonoma County, they're taking it to other counties in the state, trying to get the voters to outlaw what they define as confined animal feeding operations. And if they succeed, in California, this is the most liberal state. They're going to transport it into other states in the West and nationwide. So this is really the first, the opening salvo in a structured attack on animal agriculture. We, of course, have been working with Sonoma County Farm Bureau, with our ranchers on the ground at the Sonoma Marin County Cattlemen's Association, both to help raise some funding to fight back against this initiative, but also to kind of provide some, technical support or some political expertise on how they can seek to oppose this ballot initiative as it goes before the voters. I think, my hope is that Sonoma County voters see through what this initiative is and vote against it. I think even if it does succeed at the ballot box, which, again, I'm hopeful that it doesn't, there will be legal challenges to it. I think one issue is, this initiative is extremely vague as to what size of an operation would be outlawed in Sonoma County. Even the proponents at a recent Sonoma County Board of Supervisors meeting argued that some of those, medium-sized CAFOs wouldn't actually be prohibited under the initiative, whereas everyone else is interpreting it as, more widely applicable, as they're saying in public. So I think there's a vagueness issue as to what this initiative even would do that opens it up to constitutional scrutiny, potential litigation down the line. But I don't want to get to litigation. I want the voters in Sonoma County to vote against this initiative. I'm very hopeful they will. Agriculture is extremely important to Sonoma County. I think the people there know that. But, the threat of this initiative to Sonoma County agriculture can't be understated. And if it succeeds and, survives constitutional or other scrutiny in the courts after the fact, yeah, it's a huge threat to agriculture elsewhere in California, particularly in liberal counties and elsewhere in the U.S.
Well, if we didn't learn the lessons through our experiences with COVID about food security, and then we really need to rethink this. But this is driven by extreme animal rights activists they have one goal, and that is to eliminate animal agriculture, period. And this is simply a tool and a first step for them to get there.
Yeah, and we should say something about that. This is being, the proponents of this are in part Direct Action Everywhere. This is a group that goes onto farms and ranches.
Terrorists.
Yes, they steal animals. They commit crimes. Either 2 years ago or 1 year ago, they tried to force through an anti-CAFO bill in the legislature. And they did that by doing, stunts like supergluing their hands to the table of the Assembly Ag Committee, which then just moved and left them glued to the table. But this is, basically an unserious group of extremists who are, taking every measure they can to go against animal agriculture. This isn't about, the perceived harms that they have about confined animal feeding operations. They want to see all animal agriculture ceased in the United States. That is their stated goal. And this is their opening salvo in that war.
Exactly. Another bill that fortunately did not make it through the legislature this year dealt with the Williamson Act. And it would have, in many opinions, really jeopardized the integrity of the act. It would have eliminated the fee that was paid when a contract is canceled. And California Farm Bureau aggressively opposed it. What was CCA's opinion on this bill? I know that there's some agricultural groups that supported it, but when we really look at how important the Williamson Act is to producers of farmers and ranchers across the state of California, without that, and we were paying full property tax, it would be really hard on an already stretched thin margin for operators. If we lose the Williamson Act because we've watered it down or we've jeopardized that integrity and the purpose of it, we're going to be a world of hurt in agriculture. Where was CCA on this bill? Yeah,
so, and I don't recall the number of that bill, so apologies there. This was a bill that CCA ultimately ended up not taking a formal position on. Part of that was, we had a sense that we had a grasp of precisely what the impacts of that bill would be. But as you know, the Farm Bureau came out aggressively against that bill. Several other agricultural organizations came out in support of that bill, which caused Billy and myself to kind of step back and say, okay, we need to do a deeper dive into what the impacts of this legislation would be. That ended up not being an exercise that I needed to spend much time on because that bill ultimately did not progress out of the Assembly this year. So, it's sort of a moot issue, at least in terms of this legislative session. There may be time to look into that bill a little further because, everything that dies in the California legislature comes back. But to be brief about it, this was a bill that we didn't have a formal position on this year because it appeared more complicated than our first blush at the bill. It's something we're going to be studying later this year. If it comes up again next year, I can give you a more informed answer on that question. But I will say, the biggest priority for CCA regarding the Williamson Act, at least in my tenure at the California Cattlemen's Association, we've worked with groups like Rural Counties Representatives of California, RCRC, on this priority, is getting funding in the budget again for subvention funds to the counties under the Williamson Act. In a budget year like this year, where we have a huge deficit, that was a non-starter. A couple years ago, when we had a massive surplus, there actually was some money in the initial budget that passed that would have provided for some subvention funds. That ended up getting rerouted to other ag purposes in a revision to the budget later that year. But I think that's, something. You mentioned the importance of maintaining the Williamson Act. Part of that is subvention funding. We are committed to maintaining the Williamson Act and its benefits for California agricultural producers. So that's something we'll be looking at in the future, whether it's subvention funds or whether it's, the next iteration of this legislation you're referring to.
Yeah, I think it will be coming back from what we're hearing.
And Michael, just before you move on, just so that the audience knows that Billy, one thing about being the president, I get the call from, I talk to Billy at least once a week. I don't know if Rick might too, but, Billy and I talked about how we were going to respond to this. And it's interesting that as a Williamson Act user, I'm looking at that just like you were. This is not going to be good long-term for us. We don't want to give that up for solar farms. But Billy, as a 40 something, he was looking at it from a little bit different. So we talked about it quite a bit, but just so the audience knows, under no uncertain terms was I caving to the destruction of the Williamson.
Oh no, when you have competing ag interests on other sides, it makes it a real interesting conversation.
Yeah. It did. It was interesting listening to his perspective. Yeah. So.
But I think it will be coming back, so we'll see what we can do. One of your big successes on the legislative front and in regard to budget was in regard to wolves and compensation. In a year like this, where any appropriation request is facing a very high uphill battle, you succeeded. And just to set the stage for those listening who may not be familiar, California has a growing wolf population, and ranchers have been dealing with wolf-related issues for years. Through the Department of Fish and Wildlife, the state has a pilot program to compensate ranchers for wolf-related expenses, and that includes things like livestock losses, non-lethal conflict prevention, and other production losses. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about that part?
And apologies, I might get long-winded on this because it was our largest legislative priority this year. This all started last December, actually here in Reno, where we are recording this podcast. At the CCA convention, we had a meeting of our wolf policy subcommittee, and we knew at that time that the wolf livestock compensation program at CDFW, their funds that were initially appropriated in 2021, we had a sense that those were quickly dwindling. The department had told us that the funds weren't at imminent risk of being depleted, but we had a sense, based in sound logic, that funding was evaporating. So our membership directed us to try to renew funding for the wolf livestock compensation program in this year's budget. Initially, we had the idea of $15 million over 5 years. I spoke at the wolf policy subcommittee meeting and again at our board meeting last year and said, we will fight as hard as we can for $15 million. It's a huge budget deficit year. It only got worse as the months progressed. So we'll try to get some funding for it, maybe $3 million, maybe $15 million, maybe some lower amount. But we want to see this program continued. We want to see at least direct loss compensation for ranchers who lose livestock to wolves continued. And frankly, it's also partly a symbolic victory. If that fund gets zeroed out, the likelihood of it getting renewed for funding in future years, becomes significantly diminished. The Williamson Act is a great example. I don't think we've had subvention funding since 2011. And every year without subvention funding, it's easier for the legislature not to give us subvention funds. So we really wanted to make sure that there was at least some level of funding for that program this year. Jason, myself, Farm Bureau, we even brought Defenders of Wildlife on board to support this ask this year. We fought extremely hard in the legislature, tried to get support from the California Natural Resources Agency and the Department of Fish and Wildlife, which set up this program. I think they were supportive of our activities, but we identified some really effective legislators to carry the torch for us on this. Senator Marie Alvarado Gill, whose district encompasses a lot of the area that wolves would have to travel to go from northeastern California down to Tulare. Some of our Republican friends, Senator Dolly, Assemblymember Gallagher, and also the chair of the Assembly Agriculture Committee, Esmeralda Soria, all sort of championed this funding issue before their caucuses in the legislature and before the budget subcommittees in the legislature. Turns out that was a very effective strategy on our part. As you're probably aware, the budget that was initially passed as sort of a placeholder on June 13th didn't include a single dollar for wolf livestock compensation funding. It was just this past Saturday that a revised budget went into print. It'll actually be voted on tonight between 5 and 9. And I realize that matters not at all to your viewers who are listening, your listeners who are listening to this, in the future. But on Saturday, we got news that there was $600,000 in the revised budget for wolf livestock compensation funding. That caught me a little off guard, honestly. But I've since learned that was largely because the folks that we had been targeting in the Assembly budget subcommittees dealing with natural resources, Marie Alvarado Gill, the senator who had really been pushing this issue, as a legislator to support ranchers in her district. It was those folks that actually made sure championed and prioritized this funding in the revised budget bill. And that's why we have $600,000 going into the 24-25 budget. That's not a lot of money. It's less than the $15 million we ideally wanted, certainly less than the $3 million that we were sort of willing to settle for. We're going to have to make sure that money gets targeted and used and spent properly by the department. We want to make sure, for instance, that first and foremost, those folks that are losing calves to wolves get fair market compensation for those animals via the Wolf Livestock Compensation Program. Maybe focus a little less on things like fladry and things meant to deter wolf presence. Probably don't have the funding for pay for presence as much as we like that program. But $600,000 is some funding, and it can at least help us make sure that the most vital elements of that program continue to be funded, in the next year, the next few years, the next 5 years. And we'll be fighting to get additional funding in future budgets. And frankly, I think that job will be easier because we succeeded this year.
How much was spent last year in that fund?
So I couldn't tell you year by year exactly how much was spent, but $3 million was appropriated in September of 2021 for the Wolf Livestock Compensation Program. I think that program ran out in March of this year. So, what is that, 26 months or so? So $3 million over 26 months. 2/3 of that money was spent on non-lethal deterrence, which is the second prong of the Wolf Livestock Compensation Program. That's a really good program from the department's perspective. We certainly want to reduce conflicts with wolves and ranchers. Defenders of Wildlife really likes that prong of the program, which is part of why they joined us in this advocacy. But, seeing as it was 2/3 of the initial funding, we probably need to slow down our spending on non-lethal deterrence. Pay for presence was, a pretty significant chunk, I think $900,000 of that initial funding. And actually a very small amount of it went to direct loss compensation. I think it was less than $40,000. But that is, from our perspective, the most vital component of the program, because that's where folks are really being hit by the wolves, is losing their animals. And we know they're losing more animals that are being confirmed by CDFW. So, we at least want to see them fully compensated for the animals that CDFW confirms have been lost.
CDFW being California Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Correct.
Formerly known as Fish and Game.
Can I speak to that a little, Michael? Kirk and I have been fun touring some together because Kirk comes from the legal and what we can do. But even this compensation program is just a small Band-Aid of the real problem. The real Band-Aid comes, and it's similar to, if we want to go back to the spotted owl with what happened in the timber industry, it starts small, and then a domino effect comes until finally the final result is we burn our forests like we've done in the last few years. So the same thing's happening here. It didn't start with the wolf. The wolf's now being blamed for all these things because it's actually killing more livestock. But this started with the bear and the lion and all the restrictions of taking care of them. There's more bears, there's more lions. That means there's less space for them. So in our area, the bears and the lions have taken out our deer herd, meaning when the wolf comes, he's got to eat something. So he's eating livestock. And so the problem is really not the wolf. The problem is mismanagement of our natural resources. And it's getting to a point now in our area where they're starting to stop jobs. So economically, it's working the same way it did as the spotted owl. And so there's some things we can do. It's time we start going after the real problem. But the wolf's doing what the wolf does. And so let's figure out how we can stop that from happening, because it's going to take the whole state. And I remember Dave Daly saying, most cattlemen are only concerned with what's happening in your backyard. But this is something that's they're going to take the whole state because nothing's stopping them. I'm very interested to see what the wolf is going to become over the next few years, because it's not afraid of people. We've had some incidents that would scare people if they believed them, but most people don't believe them because we've been told the wolf's not really a threat. Well, the wolf's a threat, but we got to get to the heart of the issue, and that is taking care of our wildlife the way it should be managed. And if we can do that, if we can actually work with Fish and Wildlife in a real responsible way, we can make a difference. But right now the wolf's untouchable, so we have to go at them in a different area.
Last evening, you told a story about a wolf encounter. Would you like to share that again?
Sure. I guess it's the one where Boy Scouts were camping about probably 10 miles from me in a public campground. They heard the wolves coming down the road. They heard the wolves go down the road. Rancher friend of mine has cattle and sheep, and they probably went down to him to see if his donkey was awake, because the donkey's been doing a good job taking care of his sheep. And then about 1:30 in the morning, when the kids were asleep, the wolves came back. He estimated there was at least 20 to 30 wolves. Now it was dark, and he was scared to death. So maybe things got magnified a little bit. If I didn't know who he was, I'd say he'd been drinking or smoking something. But we know from some trail cams, from some research that's going on, there's closer to 80 to 100 wolves out there. And they're in places where nobody thinks they are. And we need to start reporting them. One of the problems with the wolves is we can't get united as an industry on this issue. We don't know if we want to collar them. We don't know if we want to, if it's good to be paid. So until we can kind of narrow that down, it's going to be a little tougher for us, because I wish they were all collared, because we know how many are out there. When people hear that there's close to 100 wolves, it's a big difference than saying there's a few packs out there, but they're not bothering anything. But it's going to grow. I hope cattlemen will start reporting all of their deaths, because we're not getting a fraction of the animals actually that are being taken by wolves reported. Well, that's easier for the department to say they're only taking so many. They're not. They're taking a lot more. They're hassling our neighbors and our friends and our relatives. Have probably had 10 kills already since they turned out in the mountains this year. And what the wolves do is they don't just stay there. As soon as the cattle come out of the mountains, then they follow the cattle back to the valley, and they stay with us during the winter, and they travel to the valley. So there's not enough for them to eat. Our deer herd is basically gone. Our small elk herd is gone. And once people hear this, especially the locals, they wake up and think, this is a big problem. So it's going to affect the economy down the road. And sometimes that's what people care about, is how it affects their bottom dollar. So it will.
Well, even if the estimate was off by a half,
yeah,
that's still a large pack for interaction with in this case, Boy Scout troop.
Yep. They came into the camp, they sniffed around, and then they took off. So that's good.
So Kirk, what other budget-related items were important to the organization, and what was the outcome?
Yeah, so one constant priority of ours in the budget is wildfire resilience, drought and flood resilience. This is a significant budget year. There were billions of dollars allocated over multiple years in prior budgets. And there was a question of whether some of that funding for wildfire resilience would get gutted this year. There were some minor trims to the multi-year budget for things like wildfire resilience, things like flood preparedness and drought preparedness. But for the most part, the vast majority of those funds that were allocated in prior years were retained in this year's budget. So, that was really just playing some defense, making sure there weren't big impacts to some of those funds that impact the ability for ranchers to continue ranching on the landscape. Obviously, in recent years, wildfire, flooding, drought have been significant impacts for ranchers. We want to mitigate those impacts upon ranchers. I think, to his credit, the governor also wants to do that. And I was pleased to see that most of that funding previously allocated for those purposes was retained in this year's budget. There were a couple of other minor things that we were focused on in this year's budget. After the Supreme Court curtailed the U.S. EPA and Army Corps of Engineers regulatory authority over wetlands, the State Water Resources Control Board wanted to come in, of course, and sort of backfill that regulatory vacuum and requested quite a lot of money in the state budget via a budget change proposal to sort of, hire more personnel, do more permitting and enforcement under that program. in this year's state budget. The problem with that is that it would have required much greater fees upon folks that are doing that permitting, including cattle ranchers. Those fees would have increased significantly. So we and a coalition of other groups fought against that budget change proposal from the State Water Resources Control Board. There is a provision in the budget that calls for the State Water Resources Control Board to study and do a report on the necessity of that program and that funding. But there is not funding for that additional staffing, et cetera. So those fees should not significantly increase for permitting of wetland issues, for instance. Another thing we fought this year, there was a proposal from 6 or 8 liberal legislators to create a program within the UC system to study alternative meat products. That was something that we were able to pretty easily, given the deficit year, fight back in budget subcommittees and the budget committees themselves on, and there is not funding allocated in the budget for the UCs to study and research and develop alternative protein products. This is something we're going to have to be looking at least for a short while into the future. There is a suggestion that some folks in the Senate are trying to get in the forthcoming climate bond proposal some funding for the UCs to do exactly that, do research and development into alternative protein products. We don't expect to have final language for the climate bond for another few days. By the time this airs, that will be in print. But that is something that while I've been here in Reno, we've been working with our contract lobbyist, Jason Bryant, to try to make sure that that language is not included in the climate bond, because there's a lot of stuff in the climate bond that we probably want to see the voters of California approve. We do not want them approving, millions of dollars for research into something that undermines California's cattle industry.
Well, not only does it undermine the industry, but there's no evidence that alternative proteins are climate friendly. And that's the ironic part of it. It's a climate bond, but not included in that climate bond are any funds, despite the request and push for, to help expand the processing side of the cattle industry. If we want to keep ranchers on the ranches, one of those ways to do that is to provide more opportunities to provide that final product to the consumer. If we have a market and an efficient and effective way to process the animal and to get that meat on the plate of the consumer, there's nothing in this bond to help with that huge issue in this state. Yet there's money being put in there for alternative proteins with no evidence that that's even climate friendly. When we know that climate friendly livestock production is a climate friendly approach. It's very ironic. So I'm glad that y'all are aware of that and are hoping and working to make that change in this climate bond.
By the way, there's ample evidence to suggest that some of these alternative proteins are actually more harmful for climate purposes than the alleged impacts of cattle grazing. There's been some reporting out of the New York Times, for instance. A lot of these products come from pea protein and soy protein that are trucked into California from the Midwest, or in the case of pea protein, largely from China. There's a lot of transportation emissions with that. And most of these companies that produce alternative meats do not report on the source of their products or the GHG impacts of their supply chain. So we've actually been pretty good at communicating to legislators, using pretty well-sourced information from sources like the New York Times, that while they're assuming that these products are friendlier for greenhouse gas emissions reduction purposes, there's no evidence to support that. And in fact, quite a bit of evidence to the contrary. And we've also been good at utilizing some of that research that's been put out through funding by the California Cattle Council that demonstrates that, there's really no more effective tool for wildfire mitigation than cattle grazing the landscape. And what we try to point out to legislators is you can't just look at the emissions that come from the cow. You have to look at the carbon sequestration in those rangelands that are productively managed by cattle grazing. And you have to look at the avoided emissions from wildfires that might spark absent that grazing on the landscape.
Cattle remove 12 billion pounds of dry mass a year. That's an incredible wildfire mitigation strategy right there.
It sounds like you've read that study from from UC that was funded by the Cattle Council.
So, mention the Cattle Council. We've talked about Farm Bureau. What do you all see, Steve, Rick, the importance of collaboration and coordination amongst these large animal and farm organizations in order to accomplish these policy goals? Because if we're all working in different paths, it makes it much tougher.
One thing we left out, Michael, in there, and we can't, is water. And that's one thing that should bring us all together, because we all need water, whether it's stock ponds or whether it's irrigation. If we don't have enough irrigation, what's the price of our feed going to be? We're in a good position right now, but that means usually that somebody else isn't. And we know that agriculture on a whole right now is in a place we maybe haven't been for a long time, when beef's one of the two highest things and everything else is not. We're not going to survive this way. We all need to make a fair share. But with our underground water problems, with water being taken away, with our government rather take down a dam than build a dam, we're in a position now that people are starting to pull back land and not plant it, just fallow ground, because they don't have enough water and they see what's coming down the road, that I'm going to just probably sell that ground or I'll just leave it there. But that's less food production. That's bad for the state. It's bad for our friends who's ever owning that land. And with, the figures better than I do, with some 6,000 acres going out of production every year, it's only a matter of time. We're in a housing shortage in the state, and we're not using the bad ground. We're using the ground that's easiest and the cheapest to build on, and that's ag ground that's all around our cities, which was most of our cities was founded on the best ground because that's where they were farming first. So we got friends up north who are in curtailment right now in Siskiyou. And I don't think, unless you've ever had your water shut off, and I laugh at my daughter when they do water restrictions in town. Oh, it's only 2 days a week now. And, and the whole town's freaking out because, yeah, there is plenty of water, but the system is broke. So we got to stop it for a few days. Well, there's plenty of water in the state of California, too, if we would manage it properly. So it's not the city's fault. It's not our fault. But again, it's a management issue. And how many propositions do we have to pass, or things to put out dollars that we've been spending to get nothing out of it? And we've been talking about the Sites Reservoir since the beginning of the time, I think. And really, there's a lot of talk, but we're not serious about it. And my fear is that we're not serious about water for the cities because they know they can take it from the farmers and the ranchers. Right. So we'll always be talking about water. Well, especially CCA.
When we have an attitude amongst many in government to, as you mentioned, to take down dams. We should be building them. We should be creating more water storage, whether that's off stream. That's probably the best, like sites. But if you have existing dams that provide flood control and water supply, and you've got folks in government saying we got to take these down, quote, for the fish, when the science isn't there to support it, it's more of a political agenda than it is science. And we're all going to pay a price, whether you're a farmer or a rancher, whether you're the consumer, whether you're the business, the residential owner, we're all going to pay the price if there's not water. Our population's not going down. There's more demands on it. We're more efficient with our water use, but we still have to have it. And it just makes absolutely zero sense to be promoting the removal of these water supply storage facilities. So kind of going back to the collaboration side, what do you all see is the importance of working together to the degree we can? Industry groups are always going to have some differences here and there, but overall, if we're picked off one by one, we're all going to lose.
I think it's extremely important. If we don't, you're right, if we don't stay together somehow, We're not always going to agree, but if we don't stay together, we're in trouble. So, I mean, yeah, we just continue to do the best we can to advocate for our industry and help others when we can, like the Sonoma issue, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we've been involved behind the scenes, let others take the lead, and a lot of times it's the dairy industry. So in that sense, I think that the forming of the Cattle Council has helped quite a bit in that collaboration effort, if you will, and that we now have dairy at the 3 dairy people representing 3 cattle people representing 3 feeder industry, which is a completely different cat than the cow-calf producer. I think that's been a benefit that's a benefit that has manifested out of that we didn't necessarily see coming, is that collaboration in the industry.
In Sacramento, I think, if you were to come to the Capitol and see the lobbyists for various ag groups get together in a committee hearing, we recognize that we are sort of in the minority in California and that we really have to band together to be strong in the state of California. So I think the ag groups actually do a great job of collaborating together. One example of that, a few years ago, we ran a livestock pass bill that would allow ranchers onto their ranches during wildfire emergencies. That was initially intended as a broader bill for all agriculture. The California Association of Wine Grape Growers had some issues with that because they have existing programs that would have been preempted by the bill that I wrote. Rather than trying to force the issue, we worked with them to narrow the scope of our bill so that it pleased them and still achieved our ends. So I think what you see in Sacramento is ag groups, bending over backward to collaborate with each other and make sure that we're not diminishing or weakening one another. And I think one thing that CCA has been good at in, recent years, particularly under Billy's leadership as the exec, is expanding beyond just sort of that ag family. As I mentioned, this year, we worked with Defenders of Wildlife on wolf livestock compensation funding. That is not an organization that you expect to see on the same letterhead of an advocacy letter as the California Cattlemen's Association and the California Farm Bureau Federation. So I think we've been very good at not just, playing nice with our ag friends and making sure that, everything we lobby on is mutually beneficial. We've been really good at sort of expanding that tent for the benefit of CCA members.
So all the work that CCA does, Farm Bureau does, other ag organizations do, is to benefit, clearly, their membership. And cattlemen work to keep cattle ranchers, livestock producers in business, producing that food and fiber for everybody. Rick, you've talked about the importance of protecting these productive lands. To each of you, how do you see the role that CCA and Rangeland Trust play together? I mean, CCA started us 26 years ago, and Rangeland Trust has become the largest agricultural land trust in the state, and it's done so by protecting nearly 400,000 acres of ranch lands, private working lands in the state of California. The tie between the two organizations is so critical. How do each of you see the efforts that CCA does and Rangeland Trust does to keep ranchers ranching in California?
Well, I think it's important, Michael, obviously, but there's no guarantee they're going to stay ranching in California, no matter what program they're in at this point. I've gotten to talking to quite a few people. I'm old. I'm not leaving California, and probably for that reason, other than we've been there for 105 years. But, and you guys are backed up and you're what you can do. I know the last time I talked to you, you had 90 projects on the books still processing through. It's an interesting position that we're in now, just in general in California, because it's hard to do anything here. And, no matter how you do it. So, you guys have done a bang up job of keeping people in place, but I don't think you can move fast enough, or is there enough money to do all that probably needed to be done. Didn't start in time. I don't know, but California is getting tougher unless we have a major change in California politically somehow. I don't know how it can get any better, and I don't know how you can do more than you're doing. I don't know how we can do more than we're doing to ensure that we stay in business, but tough question.
No, and you mentioned the 90 plus ranching families that are wanting to permanently protect their lands. That price tag is roughly about $250 million. And we really put some thought, and that's not just a number we grab out of the air. We do a lot of research into that. And California as a state is somewhere in the middle of the per capita allocation appropriations for agricultural land conservation. Delaware, of all states, is the number one. They do over $6 per capita. We are, I think, 11 cents per capita. Big difference. So there's a recognition, at least rhetorically, of the importance of protecting working lands in California amongst our policy leaders. But the money needs to be there too to back that up, particularly with the governor's agenda with the 30 by 30 and protecting these lands, conserving them. Like I said, we have nearly 400,000 acres, at least another 250,000 on that list. We can do a lot if the funding's there. Now, a year like this, as we've talked about, any appropriation request is not going to be very successful. But you're right, Steve. Without backing that up and really putting the funds there, it's an uphill battle. But we're in it for the long haul, and we have to be, and we're going to continue to do that.
Yeah, I think
Thank you for doing it.
You should be real proud of the work that CRT has done. And one of the problems we have in our industry also is not only getting together, but we think we can't do anything in California anymore. And we're using that for an excuse to not do anything. What I've learned over the last few years, the right people, you can get a lot of things done, even in Sacramento. I tell the story a lot about Billy convincing me that after an election that we didn't do too bad. Well, what do you mean we didn't do too bad? We got like 9 people on our side. He said, those aren't the people we're worried about. It's getting the moderate Democrats, the people that really maybe understand us more. They're not so tied into the political world yet. They'll listen to us. And those are the people. And that's why we've been winning, not because of our conservative people. We've been getting these moderates. And so the thing we can do is educate. And we've had tours at the ranch. We've had assembly people out by themselves. And when they get out on the ranches, they think, wow, you guys are doing a good job. Yeah, well, tell somebody when you get home, we're doing a good job. So we don't want to tell our story. And I was at a hearing a while back, and I told, the word sustainability became to where ranchers and farmers didn't even want to say the word because the definition was so broad and it was kind of negative. Basically, they're saying we're not sustainable, we're not doing a good job, and we are. So we not only need to tell them what the word sustainable means, we need to show them what it means, because people are not all against us. And if we keep that attitude that everyone's against us and we really can't do anything, we're only 1%, well, we won't go anywhere. But I see a future in people that still like to eat, and that's what we do. And they still like to know that the land is taken care of. That's what we do, getting that message out there. And how do we do that everywhere? I don't know. But that's the optimism I see out there.
I think between California Cattlemen's Association and the foundation and the council, Cattle Council, the work that this industry does and its representatives do is tremendous. And gentlemen, all 3 of you, a huge thank you for all the work you do. I know for the officers, it's a huge state to travel across, and it's the energy and effort that you all put into it is admirable, and a huge thank you for that work. The members of the Cattlemen's Association are great people, and their involvement and their actions is what makes the organization successful. So thank you to both of you. Kirk, you and your team on the staff side are amazing, and thank you for all that work you do, because it's success between the members and the officers and the staff. We wouldn't have that if it wasn't for all of us put together. So Thank you all. I appreciate your time and breaking away from the activities this week to talk with us, and hope that it's a very successful week at the mid-year meeting.
Thanks for having us.
We hope that you enjoyed this episode. To learn more about the work that CCA is doing, visit their website at calcattlemen.org or follow them on social media at calcattlemen. This closes the gate on another episode of Tune Into the Land. Be sure to hit that follow button so you can be notified when the next episode is released. And remember, you can always stay up to date on all things Rangeland Trust by following us on social media at Rangeland Trust. Thanks for listening.